to add some basic validation, we can manage more state. We can add a entered name is valid state and a set entered name is valid state updating function, which we get from use state. And here we now want to start with false, so that initially the entered name is not valid. And we can then set this to true if the entered name is valid. So therefore, here in the form submission handler, if the input is invalid, then I want to set entered name is valid to false, because it is not valid here. If we make it past this if check, we can set entered name is valid to true, because if we make it past this if check, the value is valid. And now we could use entered name is valid to show an error message. Here, below this input, inside this form control div, we could add a paragraph where we, for example, say name must not be empty. And I only want to show this paragraph if entered name is valid is false, so if it's not valid. Now we of course learned how we can show content conditionally in React, and hence here we can apply what we learned. We can check if not, hence the exclamation mark, entered name is valid, and if that's the case, we output this paragraph, otherwise we don't do anything. And we can give this paragraph a class name of error text, because that's one of the predefined CSS classes I added here in index.css for some basic styling. With that, I get this error. But now I also get this error before I even start typing. So maybe we instead want to start with setting this to true initially, so that entered name is valid is true initially. With that, if I save here, we don't see the error message initially, but if I click submit, it now shows up. So this would be one way of adding basic validation to this form and of making sure that we give the user some feedback if things go wrong. Now I actually prepared more validation feedback which we can add, and that affects this CSS class which is added on that div, that form control class. I'm not using CSS modules here, but old school CSS classes which are set up globally and then simply used here. I did prepare a special invalid CSS class which affects the input look, and therefore I want to swap form control for form control and invalid if this input is invalid. So here I could add a const name input classes, and that depends on whether the entered name is valid. If that's true, then I want to add just form control as a class. Otherwise, I want to add form-control and invalid as classes. And now class name here is dynamic and points at name input classes. Name input classes. So these classes which we're deriving here. And with that, if I save this, if I reload, we got this look. If I submit this empty form, I get this look, which looks a bit better. Now that is some perfectly fine validation which we could add, but it has some downsides at which I now want to take a closer look. One downside of the validation we added thus far is our code, specifically this line. We have this entered name is valid state, and we start with true here, which implies that initially we treat this as valid. And it turns out that that's not really the case. We just set it to true to not show this error state here ahead of time. But actually we're cheating a bit here. We're setting this state to a value that's not correct because we know that we're not going to really need that state for anything else than outputting whether this is valid or not. Now, why could this be a problem? Well, imagine you had some useEffect call in there where you do something whenever entered name is valid changes, and specifically you do something if entered name is valid is true. So if it's true, you want to do something. You want to, in this case, log name input is valid. In a real application, you might want to send an HTTP request here. So let's say we add this, and for this I import useEffect. If I do that and open the developer tools, you see that this gets logged right at the beginning before I did anything. Because of what I just explained, we incorrectly set this state here to true. And it isn't valid at the beginning. That's just not correct. We just did this as a workaround to correctly show the error feedback. Now, if you don't have this useEffect case here, you of course might be good with that, because then you have no real disadvantage of using this trick. But even then, I don't think this code reads nicely. Entered name is valid is true? Really? At the beginning? It might be nitpicking, but I'm not too happy with that. I think it makes more sense to set this to false initially, because the input is invalid initially. Hence, we might want to add a third state here, the entered name touched state maybe, and set entered name touched, where we basically control whether the user already did edit the entered name input field. And this also is false initially, because initially this input field is untouched. The user didn't do anything with it. So now we can use entered name touched in combination with entered name is valid to show this error message and to add this invalid class. Because now we don't just care about whether the input is invalid or not, but we also care about whether the user had a chance of editing it. Because if the user didn't have a chance yet, because the user didn't touch any input yet, then of course there is no reason to present this error. For this, I'll add a new constant here. Name input is invalid. And for this, I'll check if not entered name is valid. So that's the check we also have down there. But I'll combine this with checking if entered name touched is true. Because only if it was touched and it then is invalid, I want to treat it as invalid. And now it's this name input is invalid boolean, which I can use in this condition here and also down here. Though now we have to be careful, since this is now name input is invalid, we of course need to invert our logic here. Here we don't check if it's not invalid, but if it is invalid. Hence, I removed the exclamation mark. And here, I, of course, want to set this invalid class if name input is invalid and not set it otherwise, like this. With that, if we go back and we reload, initially, this is not showing this error state, but if I click submit, it's also not doing that. And of course it's not doing that because we never changed this touched state. We now need to do that. And it's now up to us how we want to change this. And one change definitely is the form submission. If the form is submitted, all inputs are treated as touched. Even if the user didn't type into them, the user submitted the overall form, which basically means the user confirms the overall form. So we could treat all inputs as touched in this case. So whenever the form is submitted, before checking the validity, just when it's submitted, I'll set entered name touched to true. Because all the inputs, and in this case we just have one input, are touched, are confirmed by the user when the form is submitted. With this added, if we now click submit, we get this error state once we submit. And this is now a little bit of a better code. It's more code, arguably, but it's cleaner. And it allows us to handle more use cases. And it also allows us to ensure that code like this here works correctly and doesn't run unexpectedly just because of some strange workaround. Now, up to this point, we're still on the left side of this slide. We are always validating when a form is submitted. We're not validating when an input lost focus or on every keystroke. Now, of course, that could be fine. That could be exactly the behavior you want. But let's now explore why we still might want to tweak that behavior in regards to certain aspects. We have the entered name is valid state, the entered name value state, so to say, and the entered name touch state. And still, this behavior isn't fully there where I want it to be. It's good that on submission it now shows us this error, but for example, it doesn't show us an error if I click in there, maybe type something, but then remove everything and click out of there. We know that this is invalid because an empty input is not allowed, but we only show the user this error message when submit is clicked. And that might be too late. That might not be the best possible user experience. I think it's better to show the user this error when the user had a chance of working on this. So if I click in there and click out of there and I leave it empty, I want to see that error that tells me that this is then not allowed. Because I had a chance of editing it, I didn't do that, now I should probably get that error that tells me, hey, you need to enter something here. So therefore, we might want to also validate on blur, as it's called, which means when the input loses focus. And that's not too difficult. Besides the onChange handler, we can also add the onBlur handler. And that's a built-in event which fires whenever this input loses focus. Hence, we can add a new function here. Let's say the name input blur handler, where we also get the default event. And then I want to bind this name input blur handler to my input here. Now in the name input blur handler, I want to do two things. For one, I want to set entered name touched to true, because if an input loses focus, it definitely was touched. The user had a chance of working on it. But in addition, we might want to start validation here. So we might want to run this logic again. So we can copy this code here and add that in the name input blur handler, so that we check the entered name, which we update with every keystroke still, and we set entered name is valid false if that name is invalid. Now we do have code duplication here, and we'll take care about that in a second, but for the moment let's take this approach here. Let's duplicate the code. It's fine for a second. So now with that, if I click in there and click out of there, I also get my warning here, which I would say is a better user experience. But now we maybe want to give the user a chance of fixing this error. And if I now start typing here, it would be great if this error disappears as soon as I entered a valid value, so that I as a user know once I did reach a valid value, once I can stop typing, for example. And that's why we also might want to validate on every keystroke now, but only in combination with the other validation steps we integrated before. Because just validating on every keystroke alone would probably not be good. We would be throwing errors at users without them having a chance of providing something valid first. But now that we do actually allow the user to provide a valid value first by listening to the lost focus and the form submission, now that we're doing that, we also want to give the user a chance of getting immediate feedback, direct feedback on every keystroke when it comes to fixing that invalid value. So that's what we're going to do now. So now I also want to validate on every keystroke. Hence, we can also copy this validation logic to the name input change handler. But actually, doing it like that would be incorrect, because here we check if it's not valid and set this to not valid if it is. But actually, of course, I want to check if it is valid on every keystroke to get rid of that validation error as quickly as possible. Hence, here, I want to check if it's not equal to an empty string and then set entered name is valid to true. And we don't need to return here, by the way, because there is no code to execute after the if statement. The same here in the blur handler. We can get rid of return there. So now in name input change handler, we are validating the input. We are setting this to true as soon as we do detect a valid input. Though here, as a side note, we shouldn't use the entered name state, but instead event target value, because we do update the entered name state with this line, But as you learned, such state updates are then scheduled by React. They are not processed immediately. So in the next line thereafter, you don't have that latest state yet. Hence here, you would be referring to an old state if you used entered name. So therefore, instead of doing that, we should use the same state data source we used for updating the state in the line before, which is the event target value here. Now with that, if we save this, if we start typing here, with every keystroke, we update this. So now we might have the best possible solution here. Now we get this instant validation once it blurs or once we submit. But then if we have an error, so if we do, for example, blur with an invalid value, we do give immediate feedback and allow the user to directly fix this with every keystroke. And I think this is a rather good user experience. What's not so good, though, is our code, because we wrote a lot of code for just one input. Now, there will be ways of reusing logic, and I'll come back to those, but I want to start with cleaning up that code here a bit, because that is definitely not the code we want to write to achieve this behavior. So what's problematic about this code? Well, we have a lot of repetition, and we have a lot of code in general just to handle this, and it just doesn't feel like the shortest possible way of writing this. And indeed, it isn't. Now, of course, one tiny piece of code we can get rid of is that code here where I use my input ref. Because I am using state here to get the value, there is no need to keep the input ref around. But that's just a small thing, I will nonetheless remove it. But that's not the main thing I want to change. Though here I will therefore also delete name input ref, remove the use ref import, and down in the JSX code, remove this ref assignment. But again, that was not the main thing. The main thing instead is this general validation logic with all those different event handler functions and what they're doing. I think it doesn't have to be that complex. In the end, we must not forget that it is all about finding out whether the input is valid and if it was touched. And if it's invalid and was touched, we want to show the user an error. Otherwise, we don't want to do that. Since that is the goal, we actually don't necessarily have to manage a separate entered name is valid state. Instead, let me get rid of that dummy useFact call. We don't need it here. Instead, we could add a derived entered name is valid constant here and get rid of that state here and just work with the value and the touched state. Because entered name is valid is simply something we can derive from the entered name state. And since this entire component function will re-execute whenever a new value is entered, we ensure that this constant will always take into account the latest value and touched state. Because whenever one of these two states changes, this component function gets re-rendered. So here in entered name is valid, I want to store the result of checking entered name, so this entered name state here, dot trim being equal or not equal to an empty string. Because this is entered name is valid, and that should be true if this here yields true. If the trimmed entered name is not empty, then entered name is valid. This means that we can get rid of all the parts of the code where we set entered name is valid, because deriving this result from the already existing states like this is enough. And here I do set entered name, hence we ensure that the component function gets re-rendered and gets re-evaluated on every keystroke, which is exactly what we want here. Now what about this name input blur handler? Well, in the end here, I also don't need to validate this. Instead, we can delete this and we can rely on this inferred state combined with this inferred value down there. Name input is invalid, which takes this inferred constant into account. The entered name is valid, which is based on the entered name value, and combines that with entered name touched. And to make this a bit easier, I'll move that constant right below entered name is valid. So these two lines of code now work together. We first find out if the entered name was valid, and we then check if it's not valid and combine that information with entered name touched. So now we still get these values, but we have to manage one state slice less. We don't have to manage the state validity. Now in the form submission handler, we of course still want to keep this if check around though to cancel the form submission if the input is invalid. But here we don't need to set the validity. Instead here we can simply check if entered name is valid is false. So this inferred variable, if that's false. If it's not valid, I want to return. I can do this here because this function, this form submission function, this handler function, also gets recreated when the component function is re-evaluated. So this form submission handler function will have access to that latest inferred entered name is valid value here. And here where I then set entered name is valid to true, that is also not needed here because we got all the code related to that which we need already in place. Now, with all of that, if we give this a try and reload, if I submit, we still see that it's invalid. If I click in there and out of there, we see this. If I enter something, this behaves correctly. But if I then submit, if I submit a correct value, it jumps back to showing me that this is invalid. And that's not a bug, but simply a result from the code we wrote here, where we set entered name to an empty string, and that indeed does result in entered name being not valid. But the fix is simple. We just also want to reset the touched state once we submit a form. So after set entered name and setting this back to an empty string, I want to set entered name touched back to false to reset the touch state. Because once the form is submitted, it of course should again act as if it wasn't touched at all, because it's a brand new form now in the end. So if we add this and then go back, now if I submit this form, it's not showing me the error again. And we now definitely slimmed down that code and have a way more readable and manageable code. And I know that it took quite a lot of steps to get there, but I wanted to make it clear what the thought process is here and why we are doing it like that. And let me get rid of that useEffect import, which we don't need anymore. With that, we have a relatively lean component here, which manages the input value and the touch state, and then derives the validity from those states.